Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Getting to Lean, Improving Patient Throughput. Today's webinar will discuss symptoms and causes of poor ED operations, ways to target improvement, tips for optimizing your design, and how to make change. My name is Amy Johnson, and in just a moment we'll be joined by our presenters. If you have any questions that you would like to submit for the Q&A at the end of the webinar, click on the icon with the question mark and type in your question at any point throughout the webinar. We'll gather these questions and try to address as many as time permits at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with an email to you one-on-one. We will have a recorded version of this session in the event that you want to go back and review the material, or if you want to share the presentation with a colleague who was unable to attend. I will distribute the recording of this event to all attendees. Leading our discussion today are Drs. Jody Crane and Chuck Noon. Dr. Crane is a practicing emergency physician in Fredericksburg, Virginia, whose work focuses on innovative approaches to ED and hospital-wide operational and lean patient flow improvement. Dr. Noon is a professor in the Department of Statistics, Operations, and Management Science at the University of Tennessee, and an expert in operational improvement, business modeling, simulation, and discussion analysis and support. Now, to kick off our presentation, here are Dr. Crane and Dr. Moon.
So, hi everyone. This is Jody Crane, and I'm joined by Chuck Noon. And we're here to talk to you today about getting to lean in the ED or improving patient throughput in the emergency department. As some of you all may know us from other presentations or some of the other work that we've done, or maybe you've read our book, but for those of you guys who don't know us, as the introduction suggested, I'm a practicing emergency physician and have worked on implementing lean performance improvement in the emergency department for about a decade, and it really kind of grew up in an ED that had a lot of promise but was struggling to sort of get ahead of the curve in terms of patient demand. My ED went from 75,000 visits to 108,000 visits in a 5-year period. So tremendous growth rate and just trying to sort of innovate and find new and great ways to see patients. For several years, I kind of tried it on my own, just kind of trying to do what I could to improve patient care. And then in 2004, I went to the University of Tennessee and enrolled in their MBA program, their physician executive MBA program, of which Chuck Noon was a founder. And so Chuck and I connected there and have been teaching together ever since. And Chuck has 3 degrees in industrial engineering, so undergrad, master's, and PhD. We like to say he's the kind of doctor that doesn't help people. Seriously, we, between he and I, we both worked with the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. We've both worked on literally hundreds of emergency departments, big, small, academic, community, rural, urban, and we've really sort of we've really been able to determine what works and what doesn't with respect to implementing operational improvement. We've seen lots of really neat concepts and ideas that other leading experts in the field have applied. Joe Garisco down in Louisiana, the split flow folks at Banner, a number of great innovations, Krista Flitch up in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of great work going on out there. And what we're going to show you today is some of the science and academics behind how you improve your emergency department. So next slide, Chuck. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk to you today about what are some of the things that you would see in your emergency department if your operations were affecting your throughput. And this may be a little bit redundant because a lot of you guys are struggling in your own emergency departments. So a lot of you guys see the symptoms, but we're going to point them out perhaps in a little bit more detail and perhaps in a way that you haven't maybe looked at them before. Then we're going to talk about how you target improvement from the perspective of someone trying to make a difference in their emergency department. What are the things you look for? What are the tools that you use? and how do you really kind of hone in on that exact thing you need to fix. Then we'll talk about optimizing your operational approach to your emergency department. We'll look at some of the best practices. We'll look at some of the science behind how you design flow, and then we'll talk a little bit about leadership culture and improvement cycles and how you get there once you know where you're going. So I'll hand it off to Chuck to kick off the presentation.
Thanks, Jody. So what we want to start out with is this whole notion of symptoms and causes of poor ED operations. Everyone feels them, but they take different forms to different types of stakeholders. We'll also talk a little bit about this notion of the lean framework, which we have found to be a very excellent way to cast your improvement efforts to realize that ongoing improvement. So if we talk about the symptoms, there's really three major categories. One is dissatisfied patients. So your ultimate customers are not happy with the quality or the experience of the care. Secondly is struggling financials, another one that we see. So we see revenue challenges, cost challenges, excessive overtime, and so forth. And the third major category would be dissatisfied staff. Within that, for example, for the patients, it usually presents itself as long and quite often unpredictable length of stay. So someone perhaps coming in for a very minor, low acuity treatment actually ends up staying, 5 or 6 or 7 hours. One day it behaves in that fashion. The next day maybe they get it in and out in 3 hours with the same type of injury. Also, you see not only in terms of long length of stay, but you see patients who leave without being seen. Of course, these are patients who come in and they will wait for some period of time, but if they haven't seen a provider or perhaps been put in a bed, they will say, well, maybe I'm not as sick as I thought. Of course, there's risk associated with that if they go home and get much worse. Or perhaps they're going down the road to another facility to seek care. The struggling financials, again, hit you on the top line and on the cost side. So those patients who are leaving without being seen are essentially lost revenue for your emergency department. But keep in mind that these are the patients that even came to you in the first place. If you are renowned for providing slow, poor quality care, odds are your competitors are seeing a lot of patients that you could be seeing. So you have this eroded market share, which again really hurts you on the top line, the revenue side. On the cost side, though, you get excessive hours, poor productivity from your providers, from your nursing staff, for all the different roles in the ED, spending a lot of time looking for stuff, clarifying, etc. The third category is dissatisfied staff. And again, if you think way back, why you went into medical school or nursing school, you probably went to provide great direct patient care. But what happens is in a dysfunctional emergency department, you find that you actually spend more time doing things like wasteful things of moving around or searching for stuff. In other words, those things that are not direct patient care. And that can be very frustrating for your staff. And that presents itself in terms of, excessive call-outs perhaps, high turnover of your nursing staff, difficulty recruiting physicians, etc. And then finally also this intra and interdepartmental conflicts. So if it feels like a toxic culture in terms of, nurses and physicians, combativeness, or between the ED and the hospital side, the inpatient side, tensions or blame storming going on. These are all symptoms, again, that are rooted in poor operations. If we look at the causes, there's really two main categories of that, and that is it's the processes within the ED are dysfunctional or the processes outside of the ED. And let's just take a deeper dive at that. So within the ED, you may not have the optimal flow configuration. Patients come in, and from there, they are flowing through what we'll call a network or series of queues as they get care in your department. And so whether, you have a fast track or not is a type of flow configuration or not. And these days there's many, depending on your acuity mix, your volume, your mission, et cetera, there's a variety of possible flow configurations. So you may simply have the wrong one in place. Secondly is misalignment of staff in time and place. What we have found is that there are some emergency departments that have actually very good designs as far as flow and really good on-the-ground processes, but they have for example, their staffing shifts are misaligned with the demand by the patients. And so you get these chronic periods of real backlogs in the ER, and then other periods where things seem to flow very well. And if you have these sort of chronic good or chronic bad periods of flow throughout a day or even days in the week, then you probably have some degree of staff misalignment. Also, lack of process standardization. I mean, think about it. If the success of how the fast track runs depends on who the provider is or who the supporting nurses are, that means there's some degree of lack of standardization. Now, I want to make sure that I don't assume that standardization means rigidity. What it just means is, have you built a system with enough best practices in place and the system to support that, to enable those providers or nurses or techs or whoever to do their best possible and most productive work. Excessive waste. So depending, again, on the process itself, the layout, and so forth, you might be incurring, again, plenty of time spent on activities that are not direct patient care. And really, anything that's not direct patient care in the lean view of things is considered to be waste. And then finally, you could have a challenging layout. You know, many ERs, date back several decades in a very different time and acuity mix and volume. And sometimes we find that the layout or the bricks and mortars just simply don't well support the type of patients that are arriving and the volumes they are. So these are all the things that, again, are typically within your administrative control within the ED, but there's no question that there are other elements outside of the ED that very much affect things like patient length of stay. The obvious one would be ancillaries. If you've got unreliable or long turnaround times for X-ray or CT or lab work, for example, that very much affects how promptly you can move patients through the ER. Also, on the admitted patient side, we get a lot of situations where the inpatient side is out of beds, and that could be due to simply the volume of that system, but it sometimes is also rooted in, for example, OR schedules and block times and things like that. So nevertheless, it backs up into the ED. You get a large number of holds, tying up your beds in the ER and hurting your patient throughput. And finally, again, the inpatient capacity may truly be there's no bed available, but a lot of times what we see is this admitted patient handoff is actually a cause. In other words, there's actually beds upstairs, but there's a convoluted process for moving an admitted patient out of the ER into the inpatient side of the house. But these are all technical elements, and what I want to point out here is that you're not moving machines around in a factory. These are knowledge workers. These are human workers, and the success or failure of a new idea or a new design for flow or a new set of processes is really, at the end of the day, going to be a function of the culture that you have, that you've put in place. Have you put in a culture of flow and high-quality patient care and continuous improvement? You can go in with the best idea, but unless the individuals that are actually going to be doing the work have an input into the design and so forth, it's probably going to end badly. So this kind of gets us into this lean framework. And lean is a way of thinking with a focus on ongoing operational improvement. The main concepts are, it focuses on the processes that deliver value to the patients. So the value that a typical ER provides is patients come in, some form of sickness, and you move them to a form of wellness. That's the value added that you provide. And so the lean says, look, let's just make sure we do that correctly. Let's put the patient at the center. Let's look at the processes for moving them from sickness to wellness and focus our ultimate attention at all levels of the organization on that. Secondly is eliminate waste in all forms. Lean is very clear about what's waste and what is not, and the sooner a team or an emergency department sort of recognizes what they're doing, what parts of what they're doing are waste and what's not, and you get this common understanding, then you can focus on trying to eliminate or reduce those wasteful elements. The third one of Lean is to promote flow from one value-added activity to the next. So the idea is, to move patients from those value-added steps of getting them better, an assessment, a procedure, and so forth. So you're trying to reduce the time in between those steps, and that's the way you promote this notion of patients flowing through your ER or flowing from your ER to your inpatient side for the admitted patients. And then finally, continuously improve the process and the people. Leaning is not saying, okay, wow, we got to this new flow configuration and we put it in place and it seems to be working pretty well and we can put up the mission accomplished banner. That's not it at all. As soon as the system seems to be running well and stable, that's actually the time where you ask the questions, okay, how can we take it up another level? How can we make it even better? I want to draw a distinction. Pure Lean is different, I think, philosophically from Six Sigma. And Six Sigma is a great, robust problem-solving methodology. It's very data-driven. But Lean is a bit more prescriptive in that, like, if you are going to move towards this Lean philosophy, you really have to hit all of those elements that we just talked about. Six Sigma has some great ability to solve problems along the way. So it's great to have some process people trained in Six Sigma. But Lean is a bit deeper in that it is a philosophy that really has to permeate all levels of the organization. And that can be a real gut check for organizations. So it may not be for everybody. And again, you're really putting the patient at the center. So sometimes you have to really make some hard choices along the way. Again, but if you do move in this direction, what do you get? And that is, it's better for your key stakeholders, your patients. In other words, if you can provide prompt, high-quality care, then you're going to be doing the right thing for patients. If you can get your caregivers more in touch with direct patient care than wasteful activities and chaos and confusion, then it's going to be better for the staff. They're going to have that sense of going home every day saying, wow, you know what, like, this worked really well. And I treated patients that were delighted we were meeting their needs as promptly as possible and in a very organized fashion. And then finally, better for the organization. If you move in the direction of Lean, then again, you will win market share. I mean, the good news for you all is you're in a growth industry. I mean, between the demographics of our country and Obamacare, for example, odds are, there's going to be greater demand for your healthcare services. And so the question is if you can accommodate that greater volume, but without having a corresponding big increase in resources or hiring and so forth, then what happens is the revenue gained goes really straight to the bottom line in that case. And again, there's no question the margins are going to shrink in healthcare. So the trick is to be ahead of the game and put in place the culture and the mechanisms for improvement instead of trying to play catch-up when you start having a lot of red ink within a system. So next thing I want to talk about really quick is this notion of targeting improvement. What to change? So if you say, okay, wow, we have some of those, we have high leave without being seen, we have length of stays that are long, we have a lot of these symptoms, then the question is, well, how do you pick what to change? What I don't recommend is training everybody in the organization in some improvement method and then turning them loose all over the place. So what happens is, at the end of the day, maybe 90% of the things they may improve truly aren't aren't hitting on the main elements of, are you providing, better patient care in a timely fashion. And so one of the key things that we advocate, of course, is making sure you have done your analysis ahead of time so you really know where you want to focus your improvement efforts. We call analysis, by the way, the great objectifier, because if you ask 10 people in your ER, hey, what do you think the problem is around here, you'll get 10 different answers. Oh, we think it's the inpatient side. Oh, it's those lazy docs. Oh, it's the nurses, And so you have all these different opinions. Data provides just an objective of representation or model for the system that says, hey, you know what, like here's where we're doing good on the patients and here's where we're doing bad. So maybe let's focus on where we're doing bad and see if we can't elevate the performance in that area. So what we advocate is analyzing, again, performance of key measures. And these are things like length of stay and when are you getting your leave without being seen and what type of patients are those. Where are there dramatic productivity differences among, say, physicians or among nursing staff, for example? What about occupancy? How does your place fill up as you go up through the day? So some of these forms take the following. So we would like to maybe stratify it by volume and patient acuity. We look at low acuity, we look at mid acuity, and sometimes we divide that into sort of vertical mid acuity patients versus horizontal mid acuity patients. The vertical don't necessarily need to tie up the bed for their entire course of care, whereas perhaps a horizontal mid acuity would. And then your more seriously acute patients, which are the ESI 1s and 2s. And so you begin to understand things like volume and leave without being seen. I mean, there's a clear correlation for this particular ER that was in North America was when their volume, when their monthly volume upticked, there was no question there was a higher proportion of patients who left without being seen. And so it was clear that whatever mechanisms and flow were in place, we're not doing a particularly great job of being robust with respect to volume. So this kind of analysis really begs, looking at or asking the question of, do you have the right segmentation strategy in place? For example, should you maybe carve out a fast track or a super track or an intake or some other type of flow configuration? Patient disposition. So you'll look at discharge and your discharge, your admitted, your observation patients. And they typically, as you know, have very different length of stays, say, between discharge and admitted patients. But the degree of that difference can be very telling. So if you're tacking on an extra 3 or 4 hours for admitted patients relative to discharge patients, then it's clear you have problems on getting those admitted patients out of the department. And that could be a number of things that you have to do to wrap up that patient in the ER, or it could be elements of things on the inpatient side and the responsiveness to needing a room. Also, patient disposition. Patient disposition also, again, it helps answer the question, is it an internal within the department or an external issue? Treatment area, fast track versus intake versus main. Again, look at your productivities and your performance between those areas, for example. So, like if you've got an ESI 4 patient who, if they go through fast track, completes care in 3.5 hours, if they go through the main and they complete care in about 3 hours and 45 minutes, then that would tell me there's not really much of a different process going on within fast track relative to the main. Whereas if they're profoundly different, then that would suggest you do have some pretty significant differences. So again, it gets into also even specifically provider differences as well as what kind of processes you have in place. Time of arrival, day of week, hour of day. We work with ERs that have big seasonal components, the high season and low season as they go through the year. And so, like for example, in the upper left, we'll look at the average length of stay for treat and release patients throughout the day. And when we see real pronounced differences between the length of stay if you arrive at 1 hour of the day versus the length of stay if you arrive at another hour of the day, that usually suggests some type of misalignment in terms of flow configuration or staff. The lower right graph, for example, we'll look at occupancy and we'll look at the status of the patient that's in the department. Are these treat and release patients or treat and admit patients in beds? Are they in beds or in the waiting room? And we'll characterize even the variation around that. That helps you in terms of capacitizing a design, for example. Time of arrival, demand capacity alignment issues. Again, these are really key. Analysis bears these out very quickly. And finally, interval of care. You know, there's pre-arrival, door-to-doc, doc-to-dispo, dispo to departure, the classic intervals that we think about when we look at an ED. And again, they have a distinct set of activities, and from a data standpoint, you'll want to timestamp and really and truly understand those. How long did it take for a patient to get into a bed? That may suggest you have either a shortage of beds, which of course is driven by your length of stay, or it may turn out you've got a front-end issue in terms of a delay at doing full triage in a queue that develops up there. So again, this helps you identify sort of longitudinally where the bottlenecks in the processes may be. So again, the door-to-doc interval has a very different mission. You're trying to get that patient in front of a physician or provider as soon as possible. So, you know, that can involve some putting elements of care literally close to the front door, which is a classic one that we see. But again, it all depends on your volume and acuity mix, whether that's the right flow configuration for you. Also, the doc-to-dispo interval, that middle interval, and that's really the one where, if you think about it, that's where really the greatest value add for an ER should occur. It's moving that patient to either get ready for discharge or stabilizing and getting that patient to the point that they are then ready to be admitted. And so we see, like, for example, this chart here just shows an old nursing staffing pattern versus the green line, which represents the recommended staffing pattern. But it was, like, looking at this, it's no question that their previous even-Steven 7-day-a-week scheduling on the nursing side was guaranteed to run into a lot of waiting on selected days of the week, the most pronounced one being that Monday. But also even within each day, they seem to be falling behind for the rest of the weekdays as well. It also begs issues as to, you know, should you use ISTAT or selective point-of-care testing if you start to look at things like ancillary turnaround times. And also it allows you to think about creative ways for conserving bed utilization, perhaps by using a results waiting area as shown in that picture. The dispo to departure interval, basically it says the following: look, there's some waiting patients that are in your ER waiting to go upstairs. And so what it says is look at the process, the handoffs that occur. And this is a big task because this is now beyond your administrative scope. This involves ER physicians, ER nurses, inpatient nurses, and inpatient or hospital side physicians. So it really requires that commitment from above up at the C-suite level. So with that, now, so we've established, you know, there's reason to change. Analysis really helps you focus your improvement efforts. And Jody will talk a little bit here about optimizing your design. So let me turn it over to Jody.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. So as Chuck showed you, there's a lot that goes on with respect to symptoms and causes of poor ED operations, and it really takes a thoughtful approach with some analytics to really figure out where you're going to target your efforts. Once you really understand where you're going to target your efforts, what are the kind of options that you have for optimizing your design? And before we kind of go into sort of optimizing your design, I think it's important to talk about some of the academics behind optimizing the design. So I know a lot of you guys over the years have heard about queuing theory. And 10 years ago when we were teaching this, you'd ask who's ever heard of queuing theory, and it'd be one or two people in a 200-person room. And now I think this whole concept of operational improvement, lean philosophy, in queuing theory has really become sort of ubiquitous in performance improvement circles around emergency departments. So we're thrilled about that. But if by chance you haven't heard of queuing theory, it's a real important sort of framework to look at how your ED is kind of operationally configured to either succeed or fail. And essentially queuing theory goes something like this. You've got a server. A simple queue consists of a server, which could be a person, a resource. It could be anybody who kind of provides, or anybody or anything who provides care for a patient. So in the emergency department, we typically think of physicians, nurses, and beds as these key servers, but there's plenty of other ones. So if you happen to have two difficult to intubate patients at the same time, then the glide scope may be a server. The CAT scan machine certainly is a server. The CT tech is a server. The lab CBC machine is a server. The iStat's a server. So there's a number of servers in the emergency department. Now, arriving to these servers would be an arrival rate of certain things. And we typically think of these as customers. And in the ED, the most kind of common thing we think of is patients arriving for care. Well, it turns out all those servers I just told you about have a lot of different arrivals as well. So you may think of a patient arriving to you for care, but lab calling you for an abnormal coag result would be an arrival to you as a server that takes up some sort of demand. A difficult, intense patient requiring an hour's worth of care is an arrival to you for care. A lab sample arriving to the CBC machine would be considered an arrival to a lab as well. So it turns out, if we just look at the flow through a queue, it's a customer arrival to a server that provides some sort of service and ultimately, results in a departure. Now, it turns out the dynamics between the arrival rate and the variation around the arrival rate will determine, and the server and its capacity will determine whether or not a queue forms. So this whole thing called queuing theory is really about being able to predict accurately whether lines will form. So it turns out the critical elements here are the arrival rate. So how quickly are things, or with what rate are either patients or tasks arriving at the server, and what's the variation around how they're coming at the server, and then how quickly, or what's the capacity of that server to do work. So what's the service rate of the capacity, and what's the variation around the capacity. So an example would be, and we typically use triage, because triage is a real great example of just a real basic queuing interface. So you may have 6 arrivals to triage, and you may have a nurse that takes 12 minutes with each patient in order to triage a patient. Well, we know that with a 12-minute average cycle time for a nurse in triage, that nurse will be able to serve about 5 patients per hour. So if you look at a queuing interface with a arrival rate of 6 and a service rate of 5, we know on average we'll be stacking up 1 patient per hour for the duration of the time that those arrival rates exceed the service rate of the server. So it turns out this variation plays a key role in your ability to service patients as well, and what we call your service responsiveness. So it turns out that 6 arrivals per hour relative to a service rate of 5 was a pretty easy example of a system that was designed to fail. But it turns out even in certain situations, a service capacity of 5 per hour, like that nurse can spend 12 minutes with each patient, and an arrival rate of 4 patients per hour can still get you into trouble, even though you have a utilization rate of 80%. And the way that works is it all depends on the amount of variation in your system. So variation exists in several forms. So if I look at the variations on the arrival side, customer arrivals may, you may have 8 patients arrive 1 hour, 6 patients arrive the next hour, 12 patients arrive the next hour, and none arrive the next hour. And so that's an example of variation on the arrival side. Likewise, you may have certain patient factors or systematic influencers that that will actually drive variation on the service capacity side. So again, using the triage example, if I've got a patient that comes in and they're 80 years old and they're a Medicare patient, they've got a laundry list of medical problems, 30 medications, and 20 allergies, I know I'm going to spend about 20 or 30 minutes just triaging that patient. On the flip side, if I have a patient that comes in and says, hey, I just lost my Dilaudid prescription, can you help me out? I don't have any medical problems and I don't even know my name, that may be a very different sort of type of triaging count. It may only take 3 or 4 minutes and the patient walks out. Either way, that variation turns out has a tremendous impact on your ability to provide care. Another example of a service variation would be not having all the supplies and equipment right at your fingertips to provide care, having to search for inventory, search for medications, search for other providers in the system. So we typically think on the service provision side, we think of controllable and uncontrollable causes of variation. So patient-mediated sources of variation would be things that we really probably don't have a lot of control over. So how long it takes a patient to stop vomiting, when a patient's back pain is treated well enough so that they can go home. But these other things I talked about, like searching for supplies and searching for providers and optimizing the patient interface, really are sort of fixable by the organization. So the kind of key take-home message from the queuing perspective is the more variation you have in your system, the more difficult time you're gonna have providing real responsive service. And it turns out as variation increases in your system, your patient delays and your average wait times are going to go up exponentially. And it turns out the same is true regarding resource utilization. So it turns out as your provider utilizations go up, so the more tasks each of your providers have on you, as you add more tasks, the weights associated with that particular server are going to go up exponentially as well. And it turns out the variation and utilization actually tag team and create a real significant problem, such that if you focus really in a real targeted manner on eliminating variation, for instance, you can function at higher utilization rates with less waiting. Same thing on the other side. If you don't touch variation, but you work very hard at decreasing the average service time, for example, you can provide much more responsive care to your patients with the same resources. So when we talk about targeting improvement and how you get to improvement, it's really all about reducing length of stay. How do you reduce length of stay? You reduce the amount of queuing in the system. As it turns out, the patient experience is simply a network of all of these queues. So there's a queue for triage. There's a queue for to see the provider. There's a queue to see the nurse. There's a queue to get into a room. There's a queue for lab, like we're seeing in the first picture here. There's that chart rack would be a great example of a queue to see the provider. Red and blue might be level 1 and 2 patients, and green may be a level 4 or 5 patient. Yellow may be a level 3 patient. There may be a queue to get upstairs on the inpatient side, and I'm sure a lot of you guys experience that every day. So the real challenge here is to kind of consider your ED a network of queues and to understand that the patient experience is simply a summation of all of those queues. Now, these queues, it turns out, have an infinite number of configurations. So the variation associated with each, the certain times during the day where certain queues are going to be, or certain resources are going to be bottlenecks relative to others. So it turns out that we've got an intensely difficult system to manage just in the fact that we've got this very, very complex system called emergency medicine delivery. It's similar to other service operations like Starbucks and McDonald's. The challenge is, if somebody waits a long time to get a cup of coffee, they're probably not going to die. They're probably not going to have a bad outcome. But if we don't get it right in the emergency medicine side, patients are going to have bad outcomes. So the stakes are much higher in emergency medicine. So Some countermeasures so if you consider queuing, you consider some of the challenges that Chuck described to you, a lot of the latest innovations, and I'll just show you a few, are really targeted at eliminating those sources of variation or reducing the queuing or eliminating the non-value-added activities between the door and the provider. This is an example, which is an intake design where you've got a patient arriving to a pivot or a screening nurse that just does sick, not sick, easy, not easy. And the sick patients go straight back. The not sick patients, we try to keep vertical, screen them in an intake room. And the benefits of these intake rooms are they're in close proximity to the patient arrival. You've stripped away all of the interactions between the door and the providers, and you've got this close, concerted, team-based effort between the doctors and the nurses to get the patient into the system, get their whatever diagnostics they need started, getting their treatment started, so that as soon as they arrive, they are in process relative to pre-process. And then, you know, if they're screened in an intake room and they actually need a room, you actually have beds available because you're actually conserving the beds by managing patients up front. And a lot of EDs are using these new kind of front-end approaches to manage patient care. And this is a great example of an intake team in a smaller ED. The next example I'm going to show you is an example of a low acuity front end. So depending on your acuity mix and the size of your emergency department, various strategies will make sense. So there's plenty of EDs where an intake team makes sense, and there's plenty of EDs where a super track or a mid-level provider up front makes sense. But there's other EDs where it doesn't. So, and it turns out in a 20,000 visit ED, you know, segmenting low acuity patients doesn't make any sense at all. It turns out in a 75,000 visit moderate acuity ED, having 3 streams of patients makes sense. And it turns out in the middle, it's very, very complicated to actually get it right if you're talking or thinking about streaming patients. So this example would be you have sufficient low acuity volume to warrant just eliminating triage for a subset of patients and turning that triage into either a nurse practitioner with maybe a tech supporting a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant, a nurse, and a tech working as a team, working through 2 to 3 patients per hour of ESI 4 and 5 patients. This is a really segmented system of low acuity care that's typically very useful in high volume, moderate acuity EDs. The next example I'm going to show you is this whole concept of podding. So some EDs have super high acuity, and turns out that you can use all the front-end tactics you want. There's just not enough of these low acuity patients there. There's some EDs that yeah, there's a front-end strategy for sure that makes sense, but also we've got to get the core of the emergency department in line. And what these pods or these team-based care models do for you is they cohort providers and nurses and doctors in close proximity. And what you see here on these dotted lines is simply, it's called a spaghetti diagram, where you're mapping where the movement of the providers are. So perhaps in the old way this particular ED was run, maybe the red dot covered the whole ED and the blue dot covered the ED. So those dotted lines might go all over the emergency department. Well, it turns out wherever those dotted lines go, docs go, and it turns out you have this wide variety of nursing interactions, stock interactions, inventory and supply interactions, and patient interactions. And it turns out just by walking through the facility, you're wasting your own resources because of movement, and you're transporting supplies and equipment and that sort of thing. So it turns out going to a model that's more of a team-based model is more efficient from a communication perspective. It decreases some of the classic forms of waste that we experience, like movement, transportation, and it enhances the inventory management and other aspects. This particular design is a nice example where if you want to kind of experiment with a front-end design and go to a pod design, this particular design had a pod, and each pod would have a couple of intake rooms. And we're seeing that more commonly, actually. You know, a couple providers bank to a set of rooms. You know, whoever's available pops up to intake. Whoever's kind of busy with patients is staying in the back managing the patients. So there's a variety of configurations. all of them target reduction of variation on the side of providing care and reducing the classic forms of waste that we talk about. So the next slide really kind of just shows that these methodologies or these approaches to patient care are really kind of are specializable. So if I took all the EDs in the country, and I think I saw one, we've worked on a 170,000 visit ED in the past, but there's a couple that are up above 200,000 for single site EDs. So it turns out if you just look at the volume bands and the distribution of patients, regardless of what triage system you're using, you can actually predict the time of day and which type of system would be preferential to use. So for instance, if I know I've got a core volume of 3 patients per hour of low-level 4 and 5 patients, then an analysis like this would tell me, hey, when's the right time to use a SuperTrack? So this particular example is with rapid medical evaluation. So it turns out like with a 40,000 visit ED, you might be able to tolerate a doc, maybe 2 doctors up front screening patients and getting them into your system in that rapid medical evaluation type framework. And all of these type of approaches are appropriate for a wide variety of EDs, but you just have to kind of understand that it's acuity based, and that acuity is ESI mix. It depends on whether you have a teaching institution or what your admission rate is, et cetera. So the next slide shows that in addition to sort of the exact process configuration that you're trying to achieve, you have to really kind of understand what your alignment of your resources is. And there's been a lot of really great work done around just aligning physicians to demand, nurses to demand, mid-level demand in this case. And it turns out if you understand your productivity level of your key servers, so how many patients per hour can they see, and then what's the specific demand to those servers, it turns out you can create a great profile of how many servers you need by hour of day. This particular example has, every day of the week. So each of these humps is just a peak during the day of the week. So you've got Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday in this graph. And essentially the blue bars represent demand, the red line represents current staffing, the blue line represents future state staffing. And essentially what you're trying to do is sort of optimize when your key providers are there. And it turns out once you know those numbers of providers that you need by hour of day and by day of week, well, then you can optimize the schedule through scheduling optimization programs. Another key component of this alignment of or operational excellence is the physical space. And a lot of you guys don't have the ability to actually optimize your physical plant right now due to either resource constraints or you just don't have it in your budget. But I was teaching an IHI course last week, and about 40% of the room said they were thinking or considering about redesigning their emergency department in the next couple of years. And so that the economic downturn and the healthcare reform caused a lot of budgets to be frozen, kind of everybody waiting to see what was going to happen. Now I think a lot of people are starting to open up again and starting to look at designs. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of really, really great designs. So don't walk into the room, sit down with an architect and have the architect say, hey, here's my design, take it or leave it. But go, hey, there's a lot of cool things we could do up front if we have radiology and lab and results waiting all in close proximity so that we're reducing the movement of staff, we're reducing transportation of patients, and we're aligning the process in direct visual sight, thereby enhancing communication. So it turns out these modern flow configurations are really starting to impact patient care and allowing us to treat more and more patients without ever even coming into the emergency department. So in terms of getting there, how do you get this off the ground? So let's say you've done the analytics, you understand where you need to head. How do you get there? How do you make change happen on the ground? And it really comes down to this lean kind of points you towards a set of tools. that you can use. And we'll talk about the tools for just a brief second, because really what it's all about is leadership and a good solid approach to change management. So these lean tools, the reason we like lean so much is because these tools are real prescriptive, they're real straightforward. Lean as a science is really kind of straightforward in terms of value and waste and understanding. You know, the average person can understand what creating value and eliminating waste means. So first step when you go back home is you say, hey, let's map the process. Let's set everybody down. Let's map the way things currently happen, and that will give us an opportunity to look at our system with all of its warts, and we can start having intelligent conversations once we've agreed that the process is the process with all of its flaws. Another tool is something called standard work, where you're so value stream mapping, looking at the process from the patient's perspective, standard work, looking at the demands on the providers that work within the system to provide the care. So it's making sure that we have reliable, repeatable cycles of care that all of our providers can provide, and making sure that what we do happens in accordance with the time allotted that we have based on patient arrivals. So when we're looking at standard work, we think of how many patients are arriving per hour. That determines how much time we have, and then we determine how much time it takes. If it takes longer than the average time that we have, then we know we need to reduce our cycle times, and we need to implement lean to reduce some of the wasteful activities that we're doing. And this is a great example here of a project that we did where we just kind of put all the stuff that's required to get a patient ready for CAT scan in one cart, so the nurses weren't running all over the department trying to get a patient ready for CAT scan. That led to an improved CAT scan process that eventually enhanced one of our intake teams, and ultimately led to eliminating oral contrast altogether in all of our departments. The next tool is called 5S, and that's just an approach to workplace organization. So it's optimizing. I tend to think of it as cleaning out your attic or cleaning out your garage, but doing it in a real systematized way. So it's sort, simplify, sweep, standardize, sustain. So it's this real rigorous approach to setting up your environment to succeed, so you can always find things. You know, there's an old saying, a place for everything, everything in its place. So you know where to find something, you know where it's used, and then you know where to replace it. And this is an example of a 5S event we did in RED, where we changed a dirty utility room into a nursing station. And next slide. This goes down to the supply level. So talking about your trays and making sure you don't have cluttering there, where you've got all these things interfering with the tools that you need to do the job. You know, then it's about, the next tool is about inventory management, developing these pull systems and having real reliable mechanisms to make sure that what you need is where you need it and it's always there. And there's one of the real fundamental kind of aspects of lean was that they mastered inventory management, found ways to make inventory replenishment very reliable, but at the same time keep very low levels of inventory on hand. This is an example of a surgical suite that implemented what we call a two-bin system, where their staff would never run out of supplies, because once they took that last item from that front bin, they would throw it into these big garbage cans, pull the back bin forward, pull from there, and by the time that front bin was now empty, the back bin would be replenished by the inventory specialist. And then it's about visual controls. So clinical controls such as this, like a sign that just tells you the status of the patient for all the providers working around the patient, or visual controls such as, again, another inventory management technique where you've got different colored bins representing the locations of different items, so you're not searching all around all of these gray bins for the one or two items that you need. Another core principle of lean is this whole thing called is rapid changeover, where quickly transforming the patient experience to a room that could care for that patient. This is an example of a room that changes over to a gynecologic evaluation room, but you could easily have a room that changes over to a laceration repair room or an intubation room or an ophthalmology room. So we're going away from specialized rooms and we're going into rapid changeover type rooms. And then this whole kind of concept of mistake proofing, signs and systems that prevent things from happening that you don't want to happen. This discharge desk is a great example of preventing a patient from walking out either before they're registered or before their treatment's been completed. And then just sort of, implementing good old-fashioned change management techniques, rapid cycle testing, making sure that you plan, do, check, act. And this is an example from Montreal where Chuck was doing a project with a transport team, and during that event they realized, hey, there's a lot of time wasted with the techs in the CAT scan department running up to drop off, contrast to patients up on the floors. So they prepackaged the contrast and stationed them on the floors so that they could do more CAT scans during the day. So great idea, plan it, get it done, check and see if it was an improvement. If it wasn't, rework it. If it was, keep going and continue to improve. And then lean management techniques. So if you don't have a dashboard's a great example of how to track data over time, sort of looking at run charts and understanding if your organization's going in the direction it needs to go. Looking at metrics, looking at intervals like Chuck talked about. This example to the right is a really great example of a suggestion board where you can write any suggestion you want, and this is from a Canadian site where they would take them out, they would approve them, they would put them on this board, and if you put up an idea, you could see what stage of implementation your idea was in. So lean goes all the way down to the management level in terms of creating these visual references that people know what's going on, and you can tell what's going on with your operations. And then the last thing is really just about what I mentioned at the very beginning is we can teach you all the tools in the world, but at the end of the day, it's really about leadership, change management, and creating this community of scientists. And all too often we see organizations that don't value people. And really what we should be doing as organizations, we should be valuing people. We're here to deliver products. We're here to make a profit because we can't survive if we don't make a profit. But we're also here to enrich people's lives. We work too hard. Work is too much of a part of our daily lives to have that part of our lives be miserable. So it's getting staff engaged, creating that vision that says we're going to be this great organization sometime in the future. And then it's about securing this commitment from all levels of the organization. So having the frontline commitment, having the top commitment to commit the resources, and then it's about having this middle management stick-to-itiveness and organization and driving these improvements. And then it's about engaging the either internal expertise, either developing it on your own, or engaging external expertise to help you get started. And we really feel strongly that, and I'm a great example. Like I knew just enough to make myself dangerous back in the early 2000s, and I just started doing things. I had no idea what I was doing, but over time I realized, hey, you just do stuff, and things will slowly kind of get better. And if you don't know how to do something, look it up and read it. So I highly encourage you guys to just get started on your own as opposed to sort of bring someone in from the outside. It's always an option, but the risk you take with bringing people in from the outside is, A, you risk kind of taking the accountability away from the people on the ground, and B, you risk being told sort of how things should be, and then when the consultants go away, you don't understand then how to go to that next level. So there's plenty of resources out there, but again, be intelligent and try to learn as much as you can on your own. And then, in terms of this whole concept of change, you want to set up this tempo of change that creates these quick wins early on and then progressively goes on to bigger and better projects so that your team has this cascading momentum heading forward. And that will increase your overall probability of success and sustainment. And then, go for it, but don't underestimate that resistance and the inertia that's just involved with change management. I don't think I've ever been in a project that didn't have a whole bunch of people resisting it that eventually sort of either came on and realized that if you're going to go in a different direction, if you're going to put the patient center of the focus and you're going to really kind of put a concerted effort on getting patients in front of providers, you may have people that don't believe in that, and people may leave your organization. And it's important to sort of to kind of understand the potential impacts of that before you ever get involved, because improvement is not a game for the weak-stomached individuals. You got to get in there, and you have to really kind of understand that making things better for the patient is something you'll be proud of and you'll look back on for the rest of your life. But it's a big change and a big leadership effort. And make sure that if you engage your folks, that you support them as a team, and you really you celebrate successes along the journey. And it's important that this is a team-based effort. It's not a vice president, it's not a director of a department, but it's a group of folks that are really focused on improving their emergency department. So that having been said, we appreciate your time in spending us an hour with us today, and really hope this has been informative to you in terms of understanding how to kind of understand what your key influences are or key symptoms of a dysfunctional ED, how you use data to look at your ED and develop the appropriate countermeasures, and the impact of change and leadership has on your ultimate success. So I know we're kind of right at the 3 o'clock mark, but Chuck and I will be happy to stay on for a few minutes to answer any questions that you might have. So have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you guys at some future events.
Hey, Jody, we do have one question. It is, what's the best team to form in order to look at improvement?
So great example, and I think or great question. I think the answer depends on what you're trying to improve, but as a general rule, you want everybody who touches the patient involved in the improvement. So if you're in the walls of the ED, you need a mix of frontline folks, and then you need a mix of sponsors. You want a lot of clinicians, a couple of sponsors, and you want the roles of the sponsors and managers should be to remove obstacles for the clinicians and support the work that they want to do. So when we typically put together ED-centric teams, it'll typically be some frontline leader-type nurses that don't have any formal management role, frontline docs, and it's really important to have physicians and nurses on the team leading this effort, but you also want to have techs and unit coordinators and registration folks, lab, radiology, and then they are supported by the ED leadership team and the vice president or higher, whoever is supporting the effort. And hopefully you have some board visibility or support for the entire effort. Now, if you're thinking about an inpatient type event, like a disposition to departure event from the ED, then you're looking at a much broader, so you're looking at folks throughout the organization like nursing supervisors, VPs of ancillaries and diagnostics and case management and home health and a cadre of different participants. Again, it's all kind of, if you look at the value stream from the start to finish of the problem you're trying to solve, just make sure you have input from everyone and that they're driving your improvement efforts.
Great. Well, that looks like our only question at the moment, but since we are right at 2 o'clock, if you guys have any questions, just send us an email and we can follow up with you guys for sure. And thank you so much for joining us. This concludes today's webinar on the behalf of the T-System. We thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.